caught in the dust storm that buried her whole town. A Lakota chief found her breathing. The horse smelled it before I did. She pulled up short on the flat, ears turned back, and I felt that in my chest before I read the sky. I'd been riding since first light, coming back from the trading post at White Clay with salt and a new coil of rope, nothing more. The sun had been clean that morning. By noon the color of it had changed, gone to a yellow I didn't trust. My grandmother used to call that color the skin of something dead. She wasn't wrong about much. I turned and looked south. The wall was maybe 10 miles out, taller than I'd ever seen a storm come, a brown curtain so solid and high it had eaten the horizon. I'd seen dust storms before. I was 43 years old and had lived every one of them on the plains, but this one had a weight to it that was different, the kind of still that comes before something takes a decision about the world. I pressed my heels in and we ran. I made the camp in time, tied Wicasa in the draw with the other horses, got the lodge skins sealed, the smoke flap closed tight. My son Chayton was already inside with the dogs pressed against him. He didn't speak. He was 10 and already good at reading the silence I keep. We sat in the dark and listened to that storm eat the land. It ran for 2 days. 2 days of sound like you've put your ear against a river, but the river is made of grit. The lodge breathed with it, the walls pulling and releasing. I slept in pieces, ate jerked meat cold. Chayton slept better than I did. Children do that, sleep through the end of things, which is probably a mercy. When it broke fast. 1 hour the sound was there and the next it was gone the way a door closes. I waited another hour after the quiet came, because storms like that sometimes lie. Then I went outside. The world was unrecognizable. Not the land was still there, still flat, still stretching. But everything small and human had been remade. A cottonwood I knew had been standing at the edge of the creek since before my father was born was half buried now, its top branches pointing sideways like arms thrown up. The creek itself had changed its channel by a few feet west. Sand had filled the bowl shapes of the low places and scoured the high ones clean. I walked south because I had no reason to walk north, and something in my legs wanted to move after 2 days still. I found the town, or what had been a town, about 4 miles from my camp. I knew it was there. A settlement, 18 or 20 families, call it Ridgeton, white people mostly. We didn't trade with them and they didn't come to us. Their presence on that land was a kind of mutual tolerance that neither side named out loud. I'd seen their smoke in winter. They'd seen mine. That was the extent of it. What was left was not a town. Some of the structures were there in outline. You could see where walls had been. The angle of a collapsed roof still held up by a single post, a hitching rail standing alone with nothing around it. But most of it was sand. 3 feet deep in places, more in others. The storm had drifted against the buildings the way snow drifts, patiently, and then the buildings had given up. A cooking pot lay in the open, half filled with dirt. A child's shoe. A Bible with its spine up and its pages fused into a block. Nobody moving, no sound. I stood in what I thought might have been the main street and listened. Nothing but the wind, which had gone down to a whisper now, sifting the loose top layer along the ground. The sound of sand moving on sand is a kind of hissing that goes on and on. I turned to go back to camp. And then I heard something. Not a voice, not a cry. A sound like I've thought about this many times since, and the best I can say is it was the sound a person makes when they're trying very hard not to make a sound. A controlled breath, coming from beneath a collapsed section of what might have been a store. I stood still and listened to make sure I hadn't invented it. There it was again. I moved to the rubble and started pulling boards away. They were heavy with sand, some of them, and the nails had swollen with moisture that the storm had wrung out of the air in those last hours. I cut my palm on a protruding nail and didn't think much about it. Pulled 3 more boards. Under the 4th one there was a woman. She was alive, that was the main thing. face down in a hollow that the collapsed roof had made over her, enough air to breathe because a section of wall had fallen at an angle and held the weight off her. White woman, maybe 30, maybe less. Hard to say, her face was so caked with dust she looked like something carved out of the earth. Her hair was red, though I could only tell because where it had pressed against the boards it was a shade lighter than everything else. Her eyes opened when I got the last board off her. Brown eyes. They found my face and stayed there. She didn't scream. I've thought about that too. I got my hands under her shoulders and lifted her out. She weighed almost nothing, or seemed to, which probably meant she was half-starved before the storm even came. She tried to stand and couldn't. Her legs wouldn't answer. I held her upright and she gripped my arm with both hands and looked at what was left of Ridgeton. She made no sound at all. I brought her to camp. I had no choice in this that I could see, and I want to be plain about that because some of what came later people in my band said was unusual, or said was my weakness for strays, or said was something else that I didn't want them saying. She was breathing. She had no one. The town was gone. What would you have done? What would any man with 2 sound legs and a lodge with room in it have done? Her name was Vera Marsh. I learned this later. That first day she didn't speak at all, just sat near the small fire I built inside, wrapped in a blanket, eyes moving over the interior of the lodge in a way that wasn't fear exactly and wasn't wonder exactly, but was something between the two. Chayton brought her water, and she drank it like she'd forgotten water was something that existed. She slept for almost a day and a half. When she woke the second time, she had a fever. That took 4 days to break. I know plants. My mother's mother knew plants better than anyone I've heard of, and she passed what she knew to my mother, who passed it to me, imperfectly, the way knowledge passes. I made a tea from the roots I kept dried and tied at the back of the lodge. I made a poultice for the cuts on her arms from the boards. She took what I gave her without question, which I read at the time as delirium and later understood was something else. On the 5th day the fever broke and she sat up and ate a piece of dried elk and said, "Where am I?" Not afraid when she said it, just asking. "My camp," I said. She nodded like that was a satisfactory answer. "The others," she said, and stopped, and then said, "Were there others?" I told her what I'd found, which was nothing living. She received this in a way that took something out of me to watch, not tears, not collapse, but a kind of slow settling, like a structure absorbing a load it didn't expect to carry. She sat with it. She didn't ask me to tell her it wasn't true or to look again. She just sat. "My husband," she said after a while. "I found no one living," I said again. She nodded. "All right," she said, and she meant it. That was the first thing I understood about Vera Marsh. She didn't say things she didn't mean. I want to say here that I didn't know what to do with her. I'm good at a lot of things. I know the land. I know horses. I know how to lead men who are harder to lead than horses. I know when a storm is coming by the color of the light. I know what plants to give a man with a fever and what prayers to say over a man who's past the help of plants. I'm not good at the particular thing that Vera Marsh required, which was the company of another person on equal footing. I had been a chief for 11 years and a widower for 3 of them, and in my experience, those 2 things both teach you to hold yourself apart. One, because people need you to be more than a man, and one, because being a man who's lost the person he shared himself with makes sharing seem like something that belongs to the past. So I kept a certain distance. I saw to her needs. I shared food. I kept the fire. I had Chayton help her when I was out of camp because Chayton was a child and had no idea he was supposed to maintain a distance. He taught her to say things in Lakota, and she taught him English words he didn't have, and they conducted these lessons with great seriousness on both sides. About 2 weeks in, one of my men, Plenty Hawk, rode through camp and saw her, and looked at me with an expression I'd been seeing my whole life from men who had something to say, and were deciding whether to say it. "What?" I said. "Nothing," he said, and then, "She's staying. Until she has somewhere to go." He looked at her again. She was sitting outside the lodge mending a piece of Chayton's shirt. She'd asked me 2 days before if she could do something useful. I'd handed her the shirt. She'd been working on it for a while because she kept stopping to look at the planes. "Where does she have to go?" Plenty Hawk said. "I don't know yet." He nodded and rode on, and I think he knew then what I did not yet let myself know. I started teaching her. This is what I can do, teach. I know the land around our camp in a way that takes years to know, and I started showing it to her because she needed to move, and the land needed to be navigated to move through it safely. I showed her which plants were safe and which were not. I showed her the places where the water ran underground and how to read it on the surface. I showed her what horse sign looks like versus what cattle sign looks like versus what she should watch for that means trouble. She paid attention in a way that was specific. She didn't look away. When I said something, she filed it. Sometimes she'd come back 3 days later and tell me something she'd worked out from what I'd said, some extension of it, and be right more often than she was wrong. One afternoon, it was late summer now, the heat coming off the flats in that particular shimmer, she asked me about the war. Not any specific war, she said. "You fought." Not a question. "Yes," I said. "Who won?" I looked at her. That question has a long answer. "I've got time," she said. So I told her, some of it. The things you can say out loud to someone who has ears for what's underneath the words. She listened. She didn't apologize, which I respected, because what would she be apologizing for, and apologies from strangers sit wrong on me. She just listened. At the end she was quiet for a while and then she said, "You're still here." "Yes," I said. "That's the part that matters most," she said, and she meant the people, not just me. My people still here, still on the land. She was telling me she understood what that meant. I'm trying to tell this straight without making it prettier than it was, so I want to say, nothing happened fast. I'm not a man who moves fast toward things. I tested it the way you test ice on a river in early spring, small steps, your weight redistributed, watching for the sound that tells you stop. What I noticed was this, that I was a better man around her. And I don't mean I was performing. I mean something in me that had gone quiet since my wife Sunkawakin died, some part of me that used to take satisfaction in the small things, a good fire, a meal done right, the sound of Chayton sleeping. That part had started to come back. Not because Vera was replacing something, but because she saw things. Because when I pointed at the way the light hit the ridgeline at dusk and said nothing, just pointed, she looked and she understood that I was giving her something I usually kept. Fall came. She'd been in camp 4 months. I had a decision to make. Not about her, she didn't push me toward any decision. She was the least pushing person I'd known. But there was talk in the band that was becoming a kind of pressure, and I am not a man who makes decisions because of pressure, so I had to be careful to make this one clean and for the right reasons. I went out alone for 3 days. This is something I do when I need to think without the sound of other people's opinions filling the space where my own should be. I rode south, sat with the land, watched the way the light moved through the days. I thought about my wife. I thought about what she would have said, which is a thing I still do and am not ashamed of. She was a direct woman. She would have been direct about this. I came back on the 4th day and found the camp going on as it always did, and Vera outside working with the horses. She'd gotten good with them. She had a quiet with animals that I'd noticed early, and she looked up when I rode in. She didn't ask where I'd been, didn't ask if I'd decided anything. That evening I sat down beside her at the fire and I said, "You could stay." She looked at the fire. "Is that what you want?" I wouldn't have said it otherwise. She nodded slowly. She picked up a stick and turned it in her hands. "I could also go," she said. "Fort Robinson is a day and a half east. I could go there, make something." "Yes," I said. "But I don't want to," she said. And she looked at me then, straight on, the fire on one side of her face, the dark on the other, and what was in her eyes was just plainness. No performance. She had weighed it and she was telling me the result. I want to stay here with you, if you'll have me. I've been in fights. I've sat with dying men. I've made decisions that had the weight of my people's lives in them. None of it felt like that moment felt. A good woman looking at you and telling you plainly that you're the one she's choosing, that she's thought about the other road and she's choosing this one. There's nothing in the world like that, and if you haven't had it, you don't know what I'm describing, and if you have had it, you don't need me to describe it further. I said, I'll have you. She put her hand on my arm, left it there. The fire crackled between us and the planes went on in the dark in every direction for 100 miles. That was all, that was enough. We were together 11 years after that. Chayton grew up with her as a second mother and turned out better than I could have hoped for alone. We had a daughter in the 3rd year, Anpao, it means dawn, who had Vera's way of looking at you like she was filing what she saw. Plenty Hawk never said another word about it, which in his case meant he'd made his peace. There were hard years. There are always hard years. I won't pretend the land got easier or the world got easier. Some of those years I held us together by the back teeth and not much more. But I held us. That was what I could do. And Vera, she understood what it meant when I sat quiet at the edge of camp in the evening and didn't want company. She understood it was not about her. She understood that some of what I carried I would carry until I stopped breathing, and that this was not a wound to be healed but a weight to be lived with. She never tried to fix it. She just stayed close enough that I knew she was there. She used to say the storm that took her old life was the worst thing that had happened to her, and the storm that took her old life was the best thing that had happened to her, and she couldn't separate those two facts, and she'd stopped trying. I didn't tell her she was wrong about that. She's been gone 6 years now. Heart in the spring. Quick. I went out to the South Flat that evening and stood where I'd found her, or close enough. The land's changed in 20 years and stood there until the stars came up. I think about how close it was. 2 days of storm and her under those boards, and 1 hour longer and I'd have been too late, and the shape of my life would have been entirely different, and not a thing I've built since then would exist. She chose me, is what I come back to. She looked at the situation plain, and she looked at me plain, and she made her choice with her eyes open. And I gave her everything I had, which was not soft and was not always easy to live next to, but was real and was steady, and was hers for as long as she wanted it. I'm an old man now. Chayton runs the camp the way I used to. Ampao married a man from the northern band who is good to her, and that is all I asked. This winter coming will be my 68th. I sit out of an evening with my back against the lodge and the plains going dark, and sometimes Chayton comes out and sits with me, and we don't say much because neither of us has ever needed to say much. But sometimes I close my eyes and I'm back in that ruined town, and the sound of sand on sand is all around me, and I'm about to turn and leave, and then I hear it. That one breath. One breath between everything that happened and everything that didn't. I pulled her out of the earth. She pulled me back into living. I think we're even.